Okay, hello everyone. This is Kyle again, coming to you with another video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about a shorter time period than we've been looking at usually. I guess we kind of got a sampling of this last time with our look at Impressionism, but I was thinking about the 20th century of music. And I thought to myself, so much is happening during this time that it really makes most sense to break this up into two units. So to have one on the first half of the 20th century and one on the second half. And so today we're going to look at the first half of the 20th century. That's the year 1900 to 1950. So quick review. In our last class, we focused on the brief but highly influential style of Impressionism. We looked at it in visual art, and we also looked at it in music. Impressionist composers are still concert favorites. All the great symphony orchestras around the world play a lot of Impressionist music still to this day because of their broad tonal palette, complex harmony, and thoughtful instrumentation. And they have this kind of hazy lack of tonal center. That idea is going to be something that comes back in this week's lecture. This idea that composers are beginning to question the idea of a tonal center and beginning to rebel against the idea that all of their work, all of their composition has to serve this original tonal center. They start to drift away from that and have new ways of thinking about tonality. Though the era is largely associated with Claude Debussy, we know that he, in his own time, rejected the term Impressionist, and he insisted that it was a poorly used term, particularly by the critics. Other people who have had this label applied to them have either agreed or disagreed with it. We have a painting here by Claude Monet. This is Water Lilies. He did many paintings of water lilies during his life, some more hazy like this than others. But I chose this because I felt like it was a particularly hazy example, a particularly impressionist example of these water lilies. Things are getting more hazy, things are getting more foggy, more unclear. And I think that's a good precedent as we move forward into the 20th century. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the world was a smaller place. Information was more freely available, literacy was on the rise, and by 1910, the percentage of persons over 14 in America who were illiterate was in the single digits for the first time since the birth of the nation. So we are more educated, we're reading information because more people can read is now able to move around the world more quickly. The new century was a time of continued boundary pushing, as always, following the chromatic saturation of the Impressionists and the Romantics in the century before. Composers in the 20th century would seek to push music to its furthest extremes yet by responding to the world around them in novel ways. And I think that is the big focus for me, is that these responses are novel. They're looking at the way that things have been done for a long time, and they're not just rebelling against the group or the style that came before them. They are completely rethinking the system. So we see a lot of questioning of what is the important thing in music, or what are new, interesting ways we can apply these same old principles, but in ways that they haven't been applied before. Outside of the classical world, we see the rise of jazz, blues, country music, as well as the beginnings of rock and roll music, which we'll look more into in our next lesson in the second half of the 20th century. It really hits its stride 1950 and after. This is usually where I list the characteristics of the era, but due to the sprawling nature of the 20th century, instead, I'm focusing on some of the big ideas in the music. So 20th, it's hard to say like these are the characteristics of 20th century music because there's just so much. There's so many different kinds of music that we'll be looking at, and they become very important during this time. So because of that, instead, I'm looking at a couple major ideas that show up in different ways. So these are kind of four different ways that artists have interpreted music during this time, or artists have filtered musical thought through these four different ideas. Many times, these things did not happen at the same time. In fact, things like neoclassicism and atonality, or more jazz and atonality, or sometimes can be opposed. Like you can't have one and the other. But these are 4 different ways that people thought about music during this time. I like to start off, I think it really sets the tone for the lectures that we have by looking at kind of what the visual artists were doing and what is the relating style in visual art. And so here's a great painting, Composition X by Kandinsky from 1939. I believe that visual art has always played a role in the evolution of musical thought. That's why I always show you guys this kind of stuff. And so some of the most influential and challenging art in the earliest 20th century can be categorized under the umbrella of expressionism. Okay? Expressionist art focused on non-representational depictions. So rather than showing a human, they might show kind of the idea of a human, or figure out a different way to express the idea of a flower or of a human or whatever, but in interesting ways, not just drawing a head and a body and 2 arms and 2 legs. Artists sought to portray an idea or an emotion rather than a scene or object. So rather than water lilies, we're getting shapes, colors that are evocative in some way of the idea of water lilies. You also get things during this time like Cubism and Futurism and Dadaism. Suprematism is around during this time. Suprematism is interesting. It's this idea that the artistic idea or the expression is more important than the thing it is expressing. You get with suprematism, instead of getting depictions of things that you might see out in the world, instead they would just paint big squares or big circles or big geometric shapes. And this is supposed to express that these fundamental geometries are the most important things here. What I like about especially this painting that we're looking at in front of us is it still contains many of the ideas that art from years and years and hundreds of years before has. We still have color, we still have lines, we even have shading. We have objects interacting with each other. We have foreground and background. But it's obviously in a really unusual way. This is not something that you would ever see out in the world, in the wild. You wouldn't be walking down the street and see these shapes or this kind of thing presented in front of you. And so it's a way of taking these old ideas about making art and say, okay, how can we push these? What's a new way of interpreting all this stuff? They're not yet asking, well, what even is art? That's something we'll ask next week. They're still saying, okay, we know what art is. We know what tactics we've used and what tools we've used to make art before. So how can we rethink the way that we use those tools? And we see that in music as well. So one of the first ways we see that in music is the idea of polytonality and polyrhythms. So polytonality, as you can guess, poly and poly, these means we're combining lots of things. Instead of mono, where there's only one, poly means many. So polytonality is the simultaneous combination of different melodic and harmonic patterns, each originating from a different key. So instead of just playing in one key, now we might be playing in multiple keys at the same time. Polytonality, many tones, many keys. Again, I mentioned earlier that we were beginning to question this idea of tonal center, and this is a great illustration of that. Stravinsky, in both of these, took both of these reins up, so he was big on the polytonality, polyrhythms, and so he and other composers use polytonality as a powerful expression tool, utilizing the often jolting dissonances to powerful musical effect. If you all of a sudden hear 2 contrasting keys overlaid with each other, it can be highly unsettling. It can be a very powerful jolt for the listener. In Petrushka, we see this especially, Stravinsky's ballet Petrushka. There's lots of polytonality in there, and I have some listening examples at the end that you guys can check out. But again, it's really unsettling. We're beginning to get away from the idea of a single tonal center, and instead we have multiple tonalities overlaid with each other, or even maybe sequenced one after the next. And in the ways that these tonalities might share certain notes that can be pleasing, maybe the composer focuses on the notes that are shared between the tonalities, but then as they drift away and begin to demonstrate some of the notes that they do not share in common, that's where we get a lot of that tension build up. Polyrhythms, as you probably guessed, is when you have two different rhythms or more sounding at the same time. Stravinsky learned this technique from African musical traditions, and we talked about this a long time ago when we looked at the instruments and even looked at what rhythm is to begin with. This idea that you can have several different rhythms going at the same time, and maybe these rhythms are, one is in duple, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and where everything can be divided into twos, and then maybe another one's in triple, 1 2 3 4 5 6, 1 2 3 4 5 6, and layering these over each other, you begin to get interesting things. You can have rhythms based on any number, groups of 1s, 2s, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7s on up. Eventually, as you can probably figure out in your mind, while these rhythms may not line up immediately, if you have a group of 4 and if you have a group of 3, they don't line up every repetition. But, if you multiply 3 and 4, you would know that every 12th beat, these things would line up together. So there will eventually be a synchronization of these polyrhythms together, and that can provide a really powerful effect where out of chaos, boom, there comes this moment of unity before, again, they drift apart. It's almost like if, you have two clocks, one slightly slower, one slightly faster. Eventually, for about 1 second of the day, they will sync up, for a moment, but then they are off from each other again. So polyrhythms, again, was a very powerful idea. We're questioning tonality with one of these ideas. We're questioning rhythmic understanding with another. Another interesting example during this time, at the beginning of the 20th century, is neoclassicism. So during the time between the ending of the First World War and the start of the Second World War, composers longed for a return to the ideas of the classical period. Balance, order, clarity, economy of sound, where we see some composers saying, like the previous group of composers, the Impressionists, the Romantics, they had chromatic saturation, and we want to go beyond that. We want to have the most chromatically saturated music possible. Some composers looked back and said, well, I want to revisit the ideas of order, the ideas of balance, clarity. I don't want to have so much noise, so many notes on the page. I want to have as few notes on the page as I can have to get across the ideas that I want. I want this idea of balance that existed during the classical period with composers like Mozart. So neoclassicism was an aesthetic choice and often did not define the entire catalog of a composer who used it. Very few people were entirely neoclassicists. They probably wrote lots of different kinds of music and then maybe did a few experiments in neoclassicism to write in that style, in the style of long dead composers, or in the style from 200 years prior. And so I think even though this might seem like not as radical as some of the other examples, I think it is quite radical to totally reject the music of your time and instead look back into the past and make music that ears have not heard for a long time, or make new music based on a dead system. I think that's quite a radical idea. On the other end of the spectrum, we have atonality. So in my opinion, atonality, instead of rejecting the Impressionists, the Romantics, and going to a time before those, atonality is the continuation of their work. They began to destabilize this attachment to a tonal key or center, and atonality says, well, what if there was no tonal center? Instead of we're in the key of C, where C is now the most important note because all other notes are judged against C in the key of C. What if every note was independent? There's no hierarchy here. No notes are more important than any other notes. In jazz still to this day, or in lots of Western tonal music, we treat certain notes of a scale more importantly than others. and we've gone over this in previous lectures, but the 1 is what we call it, or the tonal center, is the most important note, usually followed by the 5, which we call the dominant. Subdominant 4 is the next most important. And then every other note kind of fills in certain particular functions based on its proximity to 1. But in this idea, maybe a slightly more egalitarian idea, they say, well, what if all the notes were the same? None of them are more powerful than any others. None of them have more responsibility or more pull than any of the others. Atonality was a response to the sometimes rigid system for composition developed in the European tradition between the 17th and 19th centuries. In these European traditions, certain notes were favored over others due to their perceived consonance. So this idea of consonance and dissonance. By granting equal preference to all notes, atonality opened up new possibilities for music that would have previously been thought of as overly dissonant or unfamiliar or displeasing. In his 1977 book, The Structure of Atonal Music, American music theorist and musicologist Alan Forte says, quote, "The repertoire of atonal music is characterized by the occurrence of pitches in novel combinations, as well as the occurrence of familiar pitch combinations in unfamiliar environments." Schoenberg is like the important guy here. So he's the leader of what we call the Second Viennese School. The first Viennese school was Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn. They were around Vienna during the classical period and early Romantic period. And so we call them like their style of composing. They're composers of the first Viennese school. The second Viennese school was Schoenberg and many of his students. He famously utilized a version of the 12-tone technique to compose music. The 12-tone system uses a collection of notes called tone rows. So we know that in Western music, there are 12 notes in an octave. So he basically would, roll a die and then figure out where each of these notes come, and then he would have a unique arrangement of these 12 notes. There are a couple rules to how to do this. So the rules when you're putting together a tone row is that it's a specific ordering of all 12 notes. You can put them in any arrangement, but you have to use all 12, and you can only use each note once. So it's an arrangement of 12 individual notes. You don't repeat any notes. You can transform it during the composition using inversion, retrograde, or retrograde inversion, which we'll find out about on the next slide. And the row may be freely transposed to any degree. So I can move these notes all up a whole step, down a whole step, up a fifth, down a fifth, however I want. But they have to stay in kind of the same order, the same relationship to one another. So here's an example of what we're talking about with a tone row. So if I was an atonal composer, I would start off doing what's here on the top. It says, suppose the prime form of the row is as follows. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, the pollen is very bad as I'm recording this video. So suppose the original order that I put those 12 notes in is that first one there. So I start off B, B flat, G, C sharp, so on, right? And then I list all the notes. So here is one of all 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I have all 12 notes, no repeats. Well, it's kind of hard to figure out what to do next because I have these notes, but again, they have no relationship to each other. Normally, I would look at, maybe I'd play a 1 chord and then a 4 chord and then a 5, but that doesn't exist here because there's no hierarchy to these notes. So instead, to make up unique musical figures, I can do these almost mathematical operations to my music. So I could do something called retrograde, which is to take this prime form, this B, B flat, G, C sharp, E flat figure I have going here, and instead I reverse the order of all of these. So I can see instead in the second example in the retrograde, instead of it starting off with the B, B flat, G, C sharp, it actually ends, the last note is B, whereas the first note is B here. The next to last note is B flat, whereas the second note is B flat here. G to G, C sharp to C sharp, E flat to E flat, C natural to C natural, D to D, so on and so forth. So I've literally just taken the notes and reversed them. The first is the last, and the last is now the first. There's also an idea called inversion. So inversion is basically you look at the distance that the notes have either gone up or have gone down, and instead you flip that. So in the inversion one, you can see that we still start on B. In both of these examples, in the prime form and in the inversion, we both start on B. But whereas the prime form goes from B down a half step to B flat, in this example, I go from B up a half step to the C. And I can see you count by the number of half steps. You would count the number of half steps you go down here, and instead you would go up that number of half steps. And I can see here from the third to the fourth note, it goes a number of half steps up from G to C sharp. And instead, I go that number of half steps down. So it's called inversion because you invert it. You go do the opposite. Anytime I go up, I go down by that same amount, that same interval. And then finally, the last common way of transforming these prime tone rows is called retrograde inversion. So if we look here, I literally take the inversion that I've just done and I flip it around backwards. So where instead of B, C, E flat, now I have the last notes are B, C, E flat. My A is here, A. My G is there, G. B flat is there, B flat, A flat, A flat. So I just put them in reverse order. So this was, again, we're using the same musical system. We're using the 12 notes of the Western harmonic scale, but we're thinking of it in a novel way. And I want to bring us back to this picture here by Kandinsky. He's still using a lot of the techniques that painters have been using for a long time. Shading, line, color, brushstroke. But he's doing it in a unique way, just as Schoenberg and others decided to do with the 12-tone atonal system. So we're interpreting these old ideas into novel ways. And then the final thing I want to talk about is jazz. So jazz is an American art form. It originated when the descendants of slaves who were brought to this country from West Africa in 1600s, 1700s, as African music traditions begin to blend with the traditions of European Americans in the communities of New Orleans, jazz was born. Not just New Orleans, but all around the South. You have multiple musical traditions beginning to blend together in this unique stew, and all of a sudden you get a new form of music. Early jazz forms include the blues and ragtime, but over the decades it's expanded to encompass a wide range of subgenres: swing, big band, Dixieland jazz, bebop, hard bop, modal, free, Latin funk, fusion, on and on and on and on. Some of the characteristics of jazz, and again, I hope that for each of these you're thinking, how does this style reinterpret old ways of doing things and tweaking them to be slightly new. So jazz can be broadly characterized by swing time. So whereas before we counted rhythm 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and where everything was equal, each half beat is equal. Now we put emphasis on one part of the beat. So the first half of the beat is longer and the second half of the beat is shorter. So instead of 1 and 2 and, like a clock where it's always equal, with that same beat, now I'd go 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 5, da 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 da. Whereas before I had da 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 da. Every beat is equal. Now I have a swung time. Da 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 da. So this is an uneven subdivision of the beat. We have a concept of blue notes, which again is looking outside of the key, so we're playing in a certain key, and for expressive effect, you can play a note that's not in the key, usually as a leading tone, back to a note that is in the key. And for a second, it's almost like you bite into a lemon, it's very sour, it provides this dissonance for a second, and then it resolves very nicely. Blue notes can also be used to create more complex chords, which is the next thing we're looking at. So we start to get chords like ninths, 11ths, 13ths, flat fives, minor seconds, all kinds of interesting new combinations to make our chords more almost impressionist in a way. The impressionists were doing something similar, beginning to stack thirds. But if you take that idea that the impressionists were doing, where they would have a tonal center, third, fifth, seventh, ninth, 11th, 13th, maybe jazz musicians were also adding in other notes outside of the key. So in addition to like a flat 7, maybe they have a flat 5 or a minor 2. Call and response. This is very popular, especially big band jazz. You'd have, a singer who might say something, and then the band would repeat it back to him. This idea of, if you've ever heard I don't know why, but the first song that's popping in my mind is, I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. And then the other group might sing, down by the riverside. And then you sing back, down by the riverside. And so you call out to them and they respond in a way that is either exactly the same, or they respond in a way that complements the line that you've just done. I think in this, at the end, maybe I put, let me see what the listening examples are, so you can have a good example of call and response. There should be some in When the Saints Go Marching In, but I also think in the next group in the next lesson, these are a good example. Oh gosh, the song is called Minnie the Moocher, and the artist is called Cab Calloway. That's what I'm thinking of, Cab Calloway. So if you want a great example of call and response, Cab Calloway and Minnie the Moocher, there's a part where kind of in the chorus he sings, "Hadi hadi hadi ah," and then the band will sing back to him, "Hadi hadi hadi ah," and then he'll sing something else, "Odi odi odi o," and they sing back, "Odi odi odi o," and he gets more complex, and the band has to kind of keep up with whatever he does. The final and probably one of the most important pieces of like additions to like kind of the musical canon that jazz has added is this idea of improvisation. Improvisation, you're making up music on the spot. So jazz, you'd maybe play the intro, you'd play the verse, you'd go through the song, and then to elongate the song, the rest of the band will continue kind of playing the backing music to what you've played before, but instead of having a melody this time, you could pass a solo around. And so you'd point out someone in the band, and instead of playing the tune, they would make up their own tune on the spot that fit with what we call the changes underneath. So it fits with the chords that the rest of the band is playing, the chord changes, and they would play over those changes and make up something on the spot. Sometimes these were slightly rehearsed to varying degrees, but often it's very exciting to see what someone can come up with on the spot. One of the first, biggest examples, I call him the first American pop star here, was Scott Joplin. So born in Texarkana, by the end of his life, Scott Joplin was known as the king of ragtime. As a child, he learned to play piano, guitar, violin, mandolin, banjo, and cornet. He later moved to Missouri and was a piano teacher, but eventually he wrote some of the most, recognizable pieces of music, which are featured in the listening examples. I would highly recommend you listening to the Maple Leaf Rag and the Entertainer. Da 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 dum ba dum ba dum ba da ba da 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 dum ba dum bum ba da da dum ba dum ba dum ba da 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 dum ba da da dum. You've definitely heard it at least once. That's Scott Joplin. These were released in different ways. The piano roll was very popular at this time, and so there were player pianos, and so you would have these rolls of paper that had little holes in them. You could slot these rolls of paper into a specialized piano and feed the paper through, and those little holes in the paper would tell the piano with a mechanism what note to play, and so the piano would play itself. And so Scott Joplin would record himself playing, one of his compositions, the Maple Leaf Rag or whatever. And then the piano would play that for you, and so it was very popular for people to listen to in their homes or out at the juke joint or wherever. Supposedly, the Maple Leaf Rag is rumored to have sold over 1 million copies of sheet music during the composer's lifetime. So, 1868 to 1917, that 1 million copies was, if we think about inflation, that's like, bigger than Beyonce now. Yeah, but unfortunately, due to bad deal making and probably, being taken advantage of. Joplin made just enough to sustain himself off of royalties that he received from the sheet music sales, but didn't get all the music he was entitled to. Yeah, but there's a link to some of his music at the bottom of this, and I highly recommend that you look it up. So key terms: polytonality, polyrhythms, neoclassicism, atonality, jazz, swing time, blue notes, improvisation. Here's your listening examples. Yep, here's Scott Joplin, the entertainer, is here. We also have some other really great stuff. Robert Johnson, one of the most important blues guitarists of all time. Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin. Gershwin was thought of as taking jazz into the concert hall and kind of orchestrating it in a more traditional way. Rhapsody in Blue is one of the most important pieces of American music ever written because of that. But I hope that as you're walking away, I'm showing this picture of the Water Lilies by Claude Monet again. I hope that you're thinking about, all the different styles of music we've learned up to this point, the evolution of Western classical music, from the medieval ages until now, the trajectory that it was on, and then how composers and musicians rethought those ideas in these 4 different ways. Rethought the ideas of tonal center, how they adhered to it or did not adhere to it. We saw some people accepting it with neoclassicism and getting back to it, and other people totally rejecting it and going as far as you could possibly push the Western tonal system. In the second half of the lecture, so that's next week, we will look at what comes next. So now that we've pushed tonality to the farthest bounds that it can possibly go, what comes after? What's post-tonality? So until then, I look forward to that. And as always, please reach out to me if you have any questions, kyle.berry@hdtc.edu. See ya.